By the final year of World War II, many German soldiers believed surrender meant slow starvation and deliberate humiliation. They had been warned that captivity would be used as punishment rather than survival. What they encountered instead was something that made them hesitate, doubt, and question their own instincts. Food that looked nothing like a trap. As Allied forces pushed deep into Germany in 1944 and 1945, tens of thousands of exhausted German soldiers found themselves facing a choice they had been taught to fear since the beginning of the war. Years of propaganda had reinforced the idea that capture by the enemy meant deliberate suffering, slow neglect, and calculated degradation. Surrender was portrayed not as an end to danger, but as the beginning of a different kind of punishment. For soldiers who had spent months retreating under constant bombardment, hunger was already a daily reality. Supply lines had collapsed, rations were inconsistent, and many units survived on whatever could be scavenged from abandoned villages or ruined fields. Food was no longer sustenance. It was currency, morale, and survival combined into a single fragile resource. Within this context, rumors about Allied prisoner camps spread quickly. German soldiers were told that captives would be fed barely enough to survive, deliberately weakened to strip them of dignity and resistance. Some believed that food itself would be used as leverage, offered only to extract information or compliance. Others feared that meals would be withheld entirely as a form of retribution. By the time surrender became unavoidable, many German soldiers had already prepared themselves mentally for starvation. They expected hunger to continue, perhaps worsen, under captivity. Food, in their minds, was no longer something to trust. When capture finally came, it followed a familiar pattern of exhaustion rather than drama. Weapons were surrendered, positions abandoned, and men were marched away under guard. Fear remained high, but physical survival appeared secure, at least temporarily. The true test, many believed, would come later, once they were processed and forgotten. It was during these early hours of captivity that something unexpected occurred. Food arrived, not scraps, not a symbolic ration, but actual meals, prepared and distributed with routine efficiency. For soldiers conditioned to distrust generosity, the sight of American-issued food created immediate suspicion. Some hesitated to eat at all, convinced that the offering concealed a deeper intention. Others examined each item carefully, searching for signs of contamination, deception, or control. The question that spread quietly among the prisoners was simple, yet heavy with fear. Why would the enemy feed us this way? What followed was not a moment of relief, but of profound uncertainty. Because if hunger was not being used as punishment, then something else had changed. The assumptions that had shaped their expectations of captivity began to fracture, replaced by a new and uncomfortable realization. Perhaps the trap was not the food itself, but the collapse of everything they believed captivity would be. The surrender of German soldiers in the final year of the war was rarely dramatic. It came after long periods of exhaustion, hunger, and disorientation, as units dissolved under pressure and command structures collapsed. Many soldiers no longer knew where their officers were, which roads were safe, or whether the war even continued beyond the next village. By the time American forces arrived, resistance had often already faded into silence. For these men, surrender was not a decision made in a single moment, but the end of a gradual unraveling. Rifles were set aside without ceremony. Helmets were removed and dropped where they stood. Hands were raised more out of habit than fear. The expectation was not mercy, but survival measured in days rather than years. American troops approached cautiously, following procedures refined through months of advancing combat. Prisoners were searched, counted, and separated into manageable groups. The process was efficient and deliberate, designed to maintain control without escalation. Guards kept distance, weapons visible but lowered, signaling authority without immediate threat. German soldiers watched these movements closely. They were accustomed to authority expressed through sharp commands and physical intimidation, and they interpreted restraint as calculation rather than professionalism. Many believed the calm atmosphere was temporary, a controlled phase before harsher treatment began. Processing areas were established quickly, often in open fields, roadside clearings, or repurposed farm buildings. Prisoners were instructed where to sit, where to stand, and when to move. Orders were repeated patiently when confusion arose, sometimes through interpreters, sometimes through simple gestures that left little room for misunderstanding. The tone was firm but restrained, creating an environment that felt unreal to men conditioned for brutality. Despite the lack of immediate violence, tension remained high. German soldiers scanned their surroundings constantly, reading expressions, posture, and tone for signs of impending punishment. They had been warned repeatedly that captivity would be used as retribution, not protection, and that hunger would be one of the first tools employed. That expectation shaped every thought. As hours passed, fatigue began to override fear. Men who had not slept properly in days slumped where they were told to sit. Others remained rigid, forcing themselves to stay alert, convinced that exhaustion would make them vulnerable. Hunger gnawed persistently, a familiar ache that had become part of daily existence during the final months of fighting. It was against this backdrop of expectation and physical depletion that the first meals appeared. At first, the distribution of food was met with silence. Crates were opened, containers set down, and portions prepared with routine efficiency. The process lacked ceremony, which only heightened suspicion. There were no speeches, no explanations, no demands attached to the offering. Food was simply handed out according to count. Some soldiers refused to take it. They believed accepting food too quickly might mark them as compliant or naive. Others accepted the meal, but did not eat, holding it untouched as they waited for consequences that never arrived. A few examined each item carefully, breaking bread apart, smelling it, watching others for signs of reaction. The guards did not rush them. They did not comment. They continued their routines as if the act of feeding prisoners required no justification. This behavior unsettled the captives more than hostility would have. Hunger had been a constant companion throughout retreat and collapse, and the idea that it would suddenly be addressed without condition felt dangerous. If food was not being used as punishment, then the framework the soldiers relied on to understand captivity no longer applied. As night approached, many German soldiers lay awake, food untouched beside them, replaying the day's events in their minds. They tried to reconcile restraint with what they had been taught to expect. They searched for logic in a situation that refused to conform to their assumptions. The trap they feared had not sprung. Instead, something far more disorienting had taken its place. The possibility that captivity might follow rules they did not recognize, and that survival might depend not on endurance of cruelty, but on acceptance of a reality they had never been prepared to imagine. 4 German soldiers who had spent months retreating across a collapsing front. Food had ceased to be a simple necessity. It had become a symbol of survival, control, and power. Rations were scarce, irregular, and often inadequate, forcing men to live in a constant state of hunger that shaped both morale and judgment. By the time surrender occurred, many soldiers were already weakened physically and mentally, making their relationship with food deeply mistrustful. Throughout the war, propaganda had reinforced the belief that the enemy would exploit hunger deliberately. German soldiers were warned that captivity would involve slow starvation, designed to break resistance and extract compliance. Food, they were told, would be withheld or manipulated, offered only in exchange for information or obedience. These warnings lingered in the mind long after surrender, shaping every reaction to the meals placed before them. When American food was distributed, it disrupted this expectation in a way that felt dangerous. The meals were neither symbolic nor punitive. They were practical, measured, and consistent. Bread, canned goods, and hot rations appeared with a regularity that contradicted everything the prisoners had been prepared to face. The absence of conditions attached to these meals intensified suspicion rather than easing it. Many soldiers hesitated to eat, not out of pride, but out of fear. They questioned whether the food was safe, whether it was meant to weaken them, or whether it signaled a future demand that had not yet been revealed. Some believed that eating too quickly would mark them as desperate, inviting further manipulation. Others feared that accepting food meant accepting defeat on a moral level, a step they were not yet ready to take. This hesitation was not lost on the guards, but it did not prompt reaction. American personnel continued to distribute meals according to schedule, neither encouraging nor pressuring the prisoners to eat. This neutrality reinforced the sense that feeding prisoners was not a tactic, but standard procedure governed by regulation rather than emotion. Over time, observation replaced suspicion. German soldiers watched one another closely, noting who ate, who waited, and whether any consequences followed. When none appeared, uncertainty deepened. Hunger remained, but trust did not immediately follow relief. The mind, conditioned for deprivation, resists sudden change. For some, the act of eating became an internal struggle. Hands trembled as food was lifted. Each bite carried the weight of years of expectation. The absence of punishment felt unnatural, almost threatening, because it removed a familiar framework for understanding power. Hunger had been predictable. Restraint was not. As days passed and meals continued without incident, a gradual shift occurred. Soldiers began to eat more freely, though suspicion lingered beneath the surface. The consistency of nourishment weakened the belief that captivity was designed as retribution. Instead, it suggested a system that valued order and stability over vengeance. This realization introduced a new tension. If food was not a weapon, then the moral boundaries of captivity were not what they had been taught. The enemy, once portrayed as cruel and indifferent, appeared bound by rules that the prisoners themselves had never fully understood. This contradiction forced soldiers to confront an uncomfortable truth. The framework that had defined their fear of surrender was collapsing, one meal at a time. The fear of food did not disappear quickly. It faded slowly, replaced by cautious acceptance and quiet reflection. Each meal consumed without consequence eroded a layer of propaganda, exposing the gap between expectation and reality. What remained was not gratitude, but confusion as the prisoners struggled to redefine survival in a world where even hunger no longer behaved as expected. As days turned into weeks, German POWs began to realize that the food they received was not an exception, nor a temporary gesture designed to soften them for later punishment. It was part of a broader system that operated with consistency and predictability, qualities that felt deeply unfamiliar to men conditioned to expect arbitrary authority and sudden cruelty. Daily routines settled into place. Roll calls occurred at fixed times. Work details were assigned according to clear schedules. Meals arrived without ceremony, delivered with the same measured efficiency each day. The repetition itself carried meaning. Nothing was improvised, and nothing appeared driven by emotion or personal judgment. Guards followed procedures closely, and deviations were corrected quickly, sometimes by superiors who monitored conduct as carefully as they monitored prisoners. For German soldiers, This internal discipline among the guards was unsettling. In their experience, authority was reinforced through displays of dominance and fear. Here, authority appeared restrained by rules that applied even to those enforcing them. Guards who acted roughly were reprimanded. Those who violated protocol were corrected in front of others. The message was clear, though never stated aloud. Control was not personal. It was institutional. This realization altered how prisoners observed their captors. Instead of focusing solely on potential threats, they began to study patterns. They noticed that guards rotated shifts predictably, that commands were delivered in similar tones regardless of situation, and that reactions to mistakes followed established procedures rather than mood. This consistency eroded the belief that captivity would descend into chaos or abuse once attention waned. Food distribution, once viewed with suspicion, became a focal point of this observation. Meals were issued regardless of compliance beyond basic order. There were no reductions used as punishment for minor infractions, and no visible attempts to manipulate hunger as leverage. When shortages occurred, they were explained, not exploited. This transparency, limited as it was, contradicted the narrative many prisoners had accepted as fact. The psychological effect of this system was gradual but profound. Hunger began to lose its role as a constant threat, allowing space for reflection that had been absent during retreat and collapse. Men who had survived by reacting instinctively now found themselves forced to think. Without immediate danger to focus the mind, memories surfaced. Questions emerged that had been suppressed by exhaustion and fear. Some soldiers felt anger toward the system that had prepared them so poorly for reality. Others experienced guilt, questioning whether their fear of surrender had been justified at all. For a few, the realization triggered a sense of loss, as if a familiar enemy had vanished and left them without a framework for understanding their own suffering. The guard's behavior contributed to this internal conflict precisely because it remained unchanged. There were no dramatic gestures to interpret, no moments of cruelty to confirm suspicion. Restraint persisted even when frustration might have been expected. This consistency acted as a quiet pressure, forcing prisoners to reassess beliefs they had relied on for survival. As the system continued to function without deviation, trust did not emerge quickly. Instead, uncertainty deepened. The absence of overt hostility removed a clear adversary, replacing it with a structure that demanded compliance without cruelty. For men shaped by years of ideological certainty, this ambiguity proved exhausting. The trap they had feared had not materialized. What replaced it was something far more destabilizing. A system that worked, not to punish, but to manage, and in doing so, stripped away the assumptions that had defined captivity in their minds. The longer they observed this system in operation, the harder it became to cling to the belief that survival depended on enduring cruelty rather than adapting to a reality governed by rules they had never been taught to expect. For many German POWs, the most unsettling change did not come from kindness or conversation, but from the quiet realization that hunger was no longer being used against them. Throughout the final months of the war, hunger had been a constant presence, shaping every decision and every movement. It had governed morale, eroded discipline, and stripped away illusions about victory. To survive, soldiers had learned to endure it, to fear it, and to accept it as an unavoidable consequence of defeat. In captivity, that expectation collapsed. Meals continued to arrive with regularity, not generosity, but adequacy. Portions were measured, consistent, and sufficient to sustain strength rather than merely delay collapse. For men accustomed to counting crumbs and rationing bites, this reliability felt suspicious at first, then disorienting. Hunger, once a tool of pressure, had been removed from the equation entirely. This absence created a psychological vacuum. Without hunger to focus attention, other thoughts began to surface. Soldiers found themselves reflecting on events they had previously been too exhausted to process. The retreat, the collapse of command, the abandonment of positions that had once been declared essential. These memories emerged not as dramatic revelations, but as quiet questions that lingered during long hours of inactivity. Some prisoners struggled to accept nourishment without guilt. They questioned whether being fed by the enemy represented weakness or moral failure. Others worried that physical recovery would make them more vulnerable to later punishment should restraint suddenly give way to cruelty. The mind, conditioned for deprivation, resisted the idea that survival could occur without suffering. Guards did little to address these internal conflicts, largely because they were unaware of them. Food distribution remained procedural, devoid of commentary or emotional engagement. The act of feeding prisoners was treated as routine, neither emphasized nor concealed. This neutrality reinforced the sense that nourishment was not a reward or tactic, but a responsibility governed by regulation. Over time, the continued absence of hunger altered behavior within the camp. Men moved with slightly more energy. Conversations grew longer and more reflective. The constant edge of desperation softened, replaced by a cautious awareness of physical stability. Yet this stability did not bring peace. It brought questions. If captivity was not designed to punish through starvation, then what had surrender truly meant? The fear that had dominated their decision-making now appeared misplaced, yet it had been powerful enough to shape years of resistance. Accepting this contradiction required acknowledging that much of what they had believed about the enemy had been constructed rather than experienced. For some, this realization produced anger, directed not at the guards, but at the system that had framed captivity as something worse than death. Others experienced a sense of emptiness, as if the removal of hunger had stripped away a familiar struggle that once gave meaning to endurance. Survival without constant deprivation felt unnatural, almost undeserved. The longer hunger remained absent, the harder it became to sustain old beliefs. Each meal consumed without consequence weakened the idea that captivity was meant to degrade. Instead, it suggested a system focused on containment rather than retribution. This shift did not absolve the suffering of war, but it reframed it, forcing prisoners to confront the difference between fear imagined and reality endured. By the time weeks had passed, hunger had lost its power as a weapon. What replaced it was a quiet reckoning with the fact that survival, once framed as shameful, was now unavoidable. The enemy had not sought to break them through deprivation. Instead, restraint had become the defining feature of captivity, leaving the prisoners to grapple with a truth they had never been prepared to face. Once the initial shock of receiving food without condition had passed, German POWs found themselves facing a new and unexpected challenge. Survival, which had dominated every thought during the retreat and collapse of the front, was no longer the central struggle. Physical needs were being met in a way that contradicted everything they had been taught to expect, leaving space for thoughts that had long been suppressed by exhaustion and fear. As strength slowly returned to their bodies, many prisoners noticed a corresponding shift in their mental state. Hunger had narrowed perception, reducing life to immediate needs and short-term endurance. With that pressure eased, memories resurfaced. Soldiers began to recall the warnings they had received about surrender, the speeches that framed captivity as moral failure, and the fear-driven decisions that had prolonged resistance long after defeat was inevitable. This reflection did not bring comfort. Instead, it deepened confusion. If captivity was not designed to humiliate or destroy, then the choice to continue fighting, to retreat through ruined towns and frozen fields, took on a different meaning. Some prisoners questioned whether fear had been deliberately cultivated to sustain obedience, even when reality no longer justified it. Interactions among prisoners began to change as well. Conversations shifted from survival strategies to interpretation. Men debated quietly among themselves, attempting to make sense of what they were experiencing. Some argued that restraint was temporary and that punishment would come later, clinging to familiar expectations as a form of psychological protection. Others began to accept that the system they were under was genuinely different, governed by rules that limited cruelty rather than encouraged it. The guards, largely unaware of these internal debates, continued their routines without deviation. Their behavior remained consistent, neither escalating nor relaxing as weeks passed. This stability reinforced the idea that food had never been a bargaining tool. It was simply part of a framework designed to manage prisoners, not to punish them for losing a war. For many German soldiers, this realization carried an emotional cost. Survival under restraint forced them to confront the possibility that much of what they had believed about the enemy was shaped by fear rather than fact. Accepting this did not erase loyalty to comrades or the pain of defeat, but it introduced doubt into narratives that had once felt absolute. As the war drew closer to its end, that doubt became harder to ignore. Prisoners understood that they would eventually return to a society still shaped by wartime beliefs, where surrender was often judged harshly. They wondered how their experiences would be received and whether the truth of their captivity would be understood or dismissed. The first meal in captivity had marked more than a physical turning point. It had initiated a process of reassessment that continued long after hunger was satisfied. What began as suspicion evolved into reflection, and reflection into a quiet reckoning with the gap between expectation and reality. By the time liberation approached, many prisoners realized that captivity had not only preserved their lives, but altered their understanding of power, fear, and obedience. Food, once feared as a trap, had become a symbol of a system that operated not on vengeance, but on restraint. And once that realization took hold, nothing about the war felt the same again. For many German POWs, captivity did not end with liberation or repatriation. What followed was a quieter, more enduring process of understanding what they had lived through. The shock they experienced was not caused by hunger or brutality, but by the absence of both. It was the realization that fear, once accepted as truth, had been built on assumptions that collapsed the moment reality intervened. They had entered captivity expecting deprivation, humiliation, and deliberate neglect. Instead, they encountered a system governed by procedure, restraint, and predictability. Food arrived not as a reward or a weapon, but as a routine obligation. Guards enforced rules without personal malice, maintaining distance and discipline rather than dominance. This experience did not erase the suffering of war, but it forced a reassessment of what captivity truly meant. For many prisoners, the most difficult adjustment was internal. Survival without cruelty challenged narratives that had shaped their identity as soldiers. The belief that surrender was worse than death no longer aligned with lived experience. Accepting this contradiction required acknowledging that fear had been cultivated deliberately, not only to motivate resistance, but to control perception long before capture ever occurred. Returning home did not immediately resolve this tension. In post-war Germany, memories of defeat were often filtered through shame, silence, and simplified explanations. Experiences that did not fit neatly into stories of suffering or heroism were difficult to share. Some former POWs chose not to speak about their captivity at all, sensing that restraint would be misunderstood or dismissed. Yet the impact endured quietly. For some, captivity reshaped how they understood authority, revealing that power did not always manifest through cruelty. For others, it left a lingering sense of betrayal toward the systems that had demanded unquestioning obedience while preparing them for horrors that never came. The war had ended, but the process of reevaluating truth and belief continued long afterward. This story is not one of absolution or condemnation. It is a reminder that war distorts reality not only through violence, but through fear engineered to govern behavior. For these prisoners, survival came not from enduring punishment, but from confronting a reality that defied everything they had been taught to expect. In the end, the most profound transformation was not physical, but psychological. Hunger lost its power. Fear lost its purpose. And in that absence, a generation of men was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that some of the deepest wounds of war are inflicted not by the enemy, but by the beliefs carried in a battle long before the first shot is fired. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover more untold stories from World War II, make sure to subscribe to WWII Chronicle Vault. Your support helps us bring history back to life, one forgotten story at a time.